Hello class, welcome back to our Big History Review. What is awesome about this Big History Review is it is our last review. We're going to be looking at periods 6 and 7. As such, throughout these reviews, there's a lot of information that I've omitted for the sake of time and focusing on some of those bigger concepts. And as such, it is up to you guys to really figure out what are your gaps in understanding and make sure that during these last couple of weeks before our exam that you're really researching, getting down the information, and really bridging those gaps so that you have a holistic understanding before walking into that exam. Even if you guys have a good bit of your study guides filled out, if you don't have that understanding of history, then you're probably not going to do very good. So use these last couple of weeks to make sure that if you specialize in social history, for example, make sure that you have good information, good understanding, not just of social history, but political, geographical, and all of the themes within our APUSH curriculum. And part of figuring out what lack in knowledge you have and what deficiencies you have, and then figuring out how to overcome that individually is really just a good strategy, not just for online learning, but college and then like life itself. All right, but let's go ahead and dive into period 6. So period 6 covers 1865 to 1898. So what we're really looking at here is from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the Spanish-American War. So we're going to look at the Gilded Age. We're going to talk a little bit about social Darwinism, changes in the economy, the growth of capitalism, as well as expansion out west. Okay, so period 6. Whenever we look at this time period in history, it is often referred to as the Gilded Age, meaning that on the outside, this time period seems as if it has a lot of progress, a lot of developments, but inside it is rotten in a couple of different ways, such as political corruption, as well as a lot of horrendous social issues, in which we're going to see continuities and not a lot of change or progress being made here. In fact, some reversal from some of the progress made during Reconstruction. So post-Civil War, this time period, we're looking at westward expansion, which during the Civil War, one of the things that's often overlooked is the fact that the federal government is actually going to begin really encouraging settlers to develop and settle land out west, such as through the Homestead Act, in which settlers can go out west, and if they settle and develop the land for a certain amount of years, they can have that land. The federal government is going to give them that land for settling on it. So this is to encourage development out west. Another way that the federal government is going to encourage this development is through subsidies or sums of money actually given to the railroad companies to lay track and really complete that transcontinental railroad that we talked about last period. So what we're going to see is as development is happening out west, railroad development, building of settlements and towns, the telegraph as well being laid at this time for economic growth and communication. What we're also going to see is a lot of this expansion is going to lead to conflicts with the natives that are on that land. You guys know it's been a policy of the United States to, whenever you have settlers encountering Native Americans that are on land that they want, the idea and the relationship between the United States and those Native Americans is usually going to push them off the land that the settlers want, form a new treaty with them, and whenever you want that land, break that treaty again. And this is really a continuity of that, as well as some changes at this time with the relationships with the Native Americans. We really see at this time period, although reservations have been developing, there was a lot of Native Americans out west that aren't confined to reservations, but during this time period, all of the Native Americans within the United States are going to be confined to certain plots of land. And a lot of times, many tribes in one plot as well. We're really going to see the federal government just to outright deny tribal sovereignty, to really deny this group of people their rights and deny their ownership of land whenever the federal government wants that land to be settled by Americans. Those treaties are going to be outright violated, and Native Americans are going to be relocated as the federal government sees fit. So what we're really going to see here is Native Americans have a pushback, which you can definitely read more and do some more research on some of those actual battles, such as the Battle of Little Bighorn, in which you have Native Americans getting together to try to fight back against this, the last stand of the Native Americans, basically. But what we're going to see is throughout this time period, the U.S. government is actually using military force as they see fit to develop out west in a couple of different ways, not just with those battles, but also to enforce a new policy, which is a change this time, known as the policy of assimilation. And this policy of assimilation is all about Native Americans, instead of just relocating them, well, now let's actually force them to adopt and accept American culture. So what the U.S. government is going to do at this time is actually start breaking up those reservations into plots of land and forcing Native Americans to settle with the hopes they would become farmers and individual landowners, to basically force them to give up their Native American culture. And so this policy of assimilation is going to be a change at this time period, and as such, you're going to have some Native Americans react very violently to this, and some military act violently to creating this policy of assimilation. A good example of this is the Wounded Knee Massacre, in which we have Native Americans trying to continue their heritage, continue their cultural festivals, ghost dance, and we have the U.S. military outright attacking them, trying to force them to assimilate and stop their practicing their cultural heritage. And as a result, for this massacre, we're going to have about 200 Native Americans die. And what's unique about this is that within this massacre, those 200 are mostly going to be women and children. So if you guys see this picture right here, I have shown you this picture before, but basically you have a lot of attacks against the Native Americans' way of life in an effort to force them to assimilate. And in some ways, you're going to have attacks on their way of life that's really going to make it impossible for them to continue the type of economic activity that they once had in the Great Plains. So you guys know that Great Plains Native Americans, before European colonization, a lot of times those Native Americans would live off of buffalo. They were nomadic. What we're going to see at this time period is really the decrease in populations of buffaloes to a mere few hundred, making it really impossible for these Native Americans to continue their way of life. All right, guys, so whenever we look at this time period, a big theme is economics and the growth of capitalism. Now, this happens for a number of reasons. We have the growth of industrial production, factories. Basically, period 4 is about the Industrial Revolution, the growth of factories, the changes in our economy, and period 6 is a continuation of that and an increase of this, such as even more advancements and more production. And you also had a government during this time period that was really supporting the growth of capitalism as well. You guys know the idea of capitalism is the separation between the government and your economy. Now, one of your terms from this class is laissez-faire, which is basically the idea of capitalism. Let the people do as they please. And so you had a government that really encouraged this. A government that did not intervene in the economy and encourage people to do as they will to try to accumulate wealth and try to expand our economy. And really all these different factors are going to lead to a growth of American capitalism at this time. We have a lot of effects, a lot of outcomes of this growth. What we're going to see is because we have mass production in large quantities never seen before, we are able to produce more with the same amount of people and energy output. And as such, this is going to drive down the cost of goods while also increasing the wages that people are able to earn, as well as making more goods available to be consumed. We're also going to see a standard of living increase. We see a development of the middle class. So at this time period, you're going to have the growth of factories, you're going to have low wage work, and to manage this low wage work, you're going to need supervisors, and then to manage the whole factory, you're going to need some sort of bookkeeper or some sort of secretary. And then you're going to need somebody to teach the bookkeepers and secretaries and the supervisors. So this is really why during this time period we see the development and the growth of middle class America. So those are some of maybe the positive effects of this growth of capitalism. But while you have positive, you also see some negative effects, such as a growing gap between the rich and the poor. Because you have mass production in a way never seen before, the chances and the amount of money that you can make is increasing as well. So the very wealthy in America, their wealth is just increasing astronomically. While at the same time, a lot of those low wage earners, the factory workers, while their pay might be increasing, the gap between their little bit of pay that's increasing and the large increases of the very wealthy in America is just going to keep spreading. And ever since this time period, it has been spreading to today. We have a very large wealth gap. Now, at this time, you are going to see also an increase in low wage work and an increase in using children as a labor source in these factories. So those are some of the negative effects. All right, guys. So you have a lot of big businessmen who are also joining together at this time and really figuring out ways to combine their wealth in a way in which they can make more wealth, such as trust. And you also have big businessmen at this time, Rockefeller, Carnegie, who are really developing tactics to monopolize their trade. A very popular one being Standard Oil or Rockefeller's Standard Oil. So you have the growth of these very wealthy businessmen at this time. And because you have this gap and because you have this development, you also have their justifications for being so wealthy. And at this time period, one of these justifications is going to be social Darwinism. The idea that, well, these men worked hard in life, they made smart decisions, and they deserve their wealth, and they deserve to be so much wealthier than the common man because of these things. Now we know in reality it's not quite that simple. Usually you have a lot of luck, and then also if you're already born wealthy, you're kind of ahead in the first place. But this argument and this idea that hard work equals success in America is going to be something we see at this time period, and it's also going to be something that we see today. A whole idea of hard work will equal you to be able to be successful and accumulate wealth. That's the foundation of American culture. And this is one way that social Darwinism is justifying the growth of a very wealthy class of Americans at this time. So while you have these people justifying themselves, you also have other debates, such as the Gospel of Wealth, that really spoke out against social Darwinism. Now, the Gospel of Wealth, you guys can think of Carnegie with this. What we're really going to see is this argument being perpetuated that, wait a minute, the very wealthy should actually be taking care of the less fortunate. It should be their job in our community to use their vast resources and vast wealth to take care of the less fortunate. Now, if this sounds to you like socialism, that's because it is, right? It's one of the first arguments for socialism that we see within the United States. But this Gospel of Wealth and the social Darwinism is really going to be a debate at this time. Now, because you have this large class of wealthy businessmen who are sometimes taking advantage of low-wage workers, such as not paying them very much, sometimes even denying them outright pay. The government's not going to step in, and there is no minimum wage, for example. And because there's no caps on how much hours somebody can work, there's no 40-hour work week with extra pay if you go over 40. There is no regulation of the American economy at this time. Remember, it's complete laissez-faire, complete capitalism. So as such, you're going to have lower wage workers really uniting back uniting together to try to fight back against this system, to earn for themselves better working conditions, which is why at this time period we see the development and the growth of unions. One of the very first unions is going to be the Knights of Labor. Although at this time period, the government, like we said earlier, pro-laissez-faire, is really going to side with big businesses and generally not side with these unions. We also have the development of the quote-unquote New South. Now, this term was one that was argued by Southern politicians to try to advocate for the building of industry within the South. In actual reality, though, we really do not see very much industry built within the South, and the main economic activity of the South is going to be sharecropping and tenant farmer. Now, last video we talked about sharecropping, but what I found for you guys is this video, this picture over here that you can go ahead and look at. And as you can see, what really happens is sharecropping really leads to this vicious cycle of poverty. It leads to a cycle of being in debt that makes it very hard for you and your future descendants to really get out of sharecropping and to get out of this place of a low socio-economic status, which is a social problem at this time. So one of the things with these new developments that we're going to see is we have the growth of the railroad, in which you have farmers that must use this railroad system if they want to transport their crops and make money. They do not have a choice. And another thing that we're going to see whenever we look at farming at this time is the development of new tools that really does not really help the small farmer, but really helps those who can afford to buy these tools and those who are buying and consolidating farms into one large farm. We see this during this time period, which is why today in America, most of our farms are owned by companies that own several acres of land and farm. There's not a lot of small farmers left in the United States. And this shift towards small farms, towards companies owning lots of land underneath one company title and farm, we're going to see at this time period the development of that. Now, a lot of these farmers, though, have to use the railroads. And this begins to be a problem because the railroads are private companies, and as such, the railroad companies want to make money. So what the railroad companies end up doing is actually increasing their rates. And so the farmers have to pay more if they want to make money off their crops. And the farmers really have no choice. So all these things are happening, and the government tends to be helping out big businesses. And so one of the organizations that we see develop at this time is the Populist Party, an actual political party that stands to represent the common folk in America, the quote-unquote People's Party of the United States. Now, this party is going to be formed of low-wage workers and especially farmers. The Populist Party is really well known for that Omaha platform, in which the Populist Party basically just lists their demands and what they advocate for and what they support. Some things to know here with the Populist Party is this political party is really going to support the government getting involved in the economy to help out the common day people, such as the government regulating those railroad companies and stopping them from jacking the rates for those small farmers. You're also going to see the idea that the government needs to shift from the gold standard to the silver standard so that we can have increased inflation in the United States. And if we have increased inflation, we're going to have more actual dollar bills in circulation, which is going to help a lot of these low wage and especially the farmers at this time. What we are going to see is the Populist Party, they're really not quite successful. Not quite successful in getting a president, for an example, that is a populist president, and not really successful during their time of getting legislation passed that benefits them. But these ideas and these things that this political party is advocating for are going to be ideas that will be adopted eventually in the progressive era. So you have this time period, and you have a lot of people speaking out during this time period, and as such, we are going to see a change later on in response to the needs of the American people and all this stuff that's going down. We do have increased immigration at this time, especially from what we call new immigrants, such as from Asia and Southern and Europe, basically areas of the world that is not Northern and Western Europe. Northern and Western Europe tend to make up what we call old immigrants. And these immigrants were majority of the where immigration came from in the United States in the first 100 years of our nation and during the colonies as well. So this quote unquote new immigrants are coming in from different areas. Now, because you have this increase in immigration, especially increase in immigration from populations that you didn't really have before, we are going to see an increase in nativism, an increase in nativist ideology, which is, remember, nativist ideology is Americans who oppose immigration, who do not think that immigrants should be coming into the United States. One of their core arguments was that immigrants steal jobs, which is very interesting because that is, if you speak with a current nativist supporter today or someone who supports the decrease or the stopping of immigration current days, often that's what a lot of people will still say. So it's interesting that nativist arguments during the 1800s are still some of the nativist arguments today, although we do not see nearly as much nativism today as you see during this time period. So what we're going to see because this nativism is because this ideology against immigration is legislation passed by Congress to stop all Chinese immigration at this time. Now, that is a complete stop to Chinese immigration. And we're not really going to see a reversal of this until the 1940s. So we have a good period in American history in which there were no immigrants coming in from China. So at this time, whenever we look at immigration, another thing that's going to be debated is this idea of, well, should these immigrants completely become American? Should they basically assimilate into our culture and take on a complete American identity? Or should they be able to maintain some of their heritage from wherever they're from? This is going to be a debate at this time. And some of the things that you see during this time period is really the growth of these ethnic communities in which you have people from one culture that are getting together to be able to keep alive their heritage, keep alive their language, and really network together to try to help themselves out in this new country. All right, so one of the consequences of capitalism and mass production is going to be urbanization as more jobs are available in the city. And as you see the decline in small farms, what you're going to see is an increase in people living in the city. Now, we see a couple of different effects from this. Some of the things that we talked about in class are effects such as, how do you transport all these new people? How do you create a system in which a city can be clean, it can be orderly? Another thing is dealing with politics, political machines. You're going to have some political parties and groups of politicians in these cities who really look at the growth of cities as a way to tap into this market and completely control a group of people who all live in one area, which is what we see with these political machines. We see the growth of politicians who are very corrupt in these cities, who maintain their power in these cities, usually through holding jobs, sometimes by paying off voters, sometimes by actually intimidating people who wanted to vote against them to maintain their power. So a lot of corruption in these cities. One of the things that we also see are settlement houses, going back to immigration. And these settlement houses are really going to help out low-income individuals as well as immigrants to adapt to American society. The most famous settlement house is going to be Jane Addams' Hull House. So, like I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of changes during this time period, but we have some pretty horrendous continuities and a lot of social issues that are really not addressed into actual change within new laws anyways within the United States. We are going to have Plessy versus Ferguson, which is going to be a Supreme Court decision to uphold Jim Crow laws and uphold segregation within southern United States. We are going to have the KKK that is going to arise during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, in which we see an organization dedicated to the oppression of minority groups. I do want you guys to know that we're fixing to talk about the 1920s here in a couple of minutes. Whenever we talk about the 1920s, one of the things is the KKK does turn towards targeting immigrants as well as African Americans and trying to oppress them. It is important to note, though, that while you have these continuities, you do have people fighting back. And it's really important to understand that not just during this time period, but before the Civil War, whenever the South had slavery as an institution, that people were always fighting back. Rather that was slave revolts, or rather that was abolitionists. And during this time period, it's going to be people like Ida B. Wells, who are writing papers, who actually had a newspaper dedicated to advocating for more rights for African Americans, and also dedicated to letting people know the horrible activities that is going down the South, such as the lynching and the activities of the KKK, the oppression of African Americans, as well as other individuals like Booker T. Washington, who is writing and helping to unite people to push for more rights for African Americans and minority groups. It's important to understand that while you have these horrendous continuities, you have always had people pushing back and trying to create change within the United States. All right, guys, period 7. So the dates for this period, 1890 to 1945. 1890 is important because this is what we call the closing off of the frontier, the end of a lot of that initial development out west, and as such, companies are going to look to areas outside the nation to try to expand their economic activity. And then we have 1945, which is going to be the end of World War II and the end of your content for your 2020 exam. Now, this time period focuses on U.S. expansion overseas, in particular U.S. imperialism, interventionism, reform of the progressive era, World War I, World War II, as well as the Great Depression and the New Deal, which is the United States response to this Great Depression. All right, so one of the things you need to know is this period, one of the main themes of this period is going to be this idea of what is America's role in the world? That's going to be some of the very first content that we really look at. We see this again in World War I. We see this again, especially in World War II. What should the United States be doing? Should the United States be an isolationist nation in which the United States does not get involved in others' affairs? Or should the United States be an interventionist nation in which the United States is getting involved, rather it is economically or politically? What is the role of the United States in our entire globe? This is a question, this is a development within this time period. And really what we see is a gradual shift towards increased interventionism, which is interesting because this interventionism has not really decreased up to current day. The United States still plays an intervening role in the world. Now, but during this time period, so at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, one of the things that we do see is U.S. interventionism, and particularly in Central and South America. And a lot of the biggest reasons for this is going to be economic. Basically, American companies are looking to how can they increase profits. And one of the ideas is, well, if we can increase our consumer base, then we can sell more stuff. And we can sell more stuff, we can make more money. So the idea is to actually spread outside the United States to try to develop relationships with other countries in which they come to the United States to buy most of their goods. So it is the United States that can profit from the selling of these goods. So that's going to be the main reason. You're also going to see some other reasons or arguments at this time period, such as competition, that the United States shouldn't be left behind European nations with colonization, that the United States should be going forth and trying to exert itself militarily, as well as racial theories. such as the white man's burden, which was a racist argument for imperialism at this time that basically states that the Anglo-Saxon race and culture is superior, and therefore the United States should be expanding to expand this culture and race. So you have racist arguments too. Spanish-American War. This is going to be U.S. versus Spain. U.S. wins. As an outcome, where the United States is going to gain Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, which will eventually lead to the suppression of people within the Philippines fighting for their independence, which this is not always popular history. This is a time period in American history in which the United States was actually fighting to stop and try to suppress individuals seeking their own independence and self-rule status. Luca? Okay. So at this time period, you're also going to have debates arising about all these things. Like we mentioned earlier, what should the role of the United States be? Should the United States be an imperialist nation? One of those supporters of imperialism is going to be Teddy Roosevelt. We can definitely see this during his presidency, such as the building of the Panama Canal and the United States intervening in Central and South America. We also have anti-imperialist people fighting, saying that the United States should be more of an isolationist nation, such as the organization of the Anti-Imperialist League. All right, so that's going to lead us to the Progressive Era, in which we had the Gilded Age. We had this time period in which a lot of people are saying, hey, the government needs to be involved in the economy to try to protect the common day folk. And what we see during the Progressive Era is we see the government becoming involved in the economy and really starting to meet the demands of these people, progressives during this time period. Some of the actual laws that we have put forth is going to be Sherman's Antitrust Act, which is going to break up monopolies. We're going to have the Meat Inspection Act, which is going to try to inspect the production of foodstuffs to make sure that the American people are not being tricked eating quality goods, making sure there's a system to do that anyways. And then the Keating-Owens Act, which is going to be an act put forth to try to stop child labor in factories. So we have these laws in which the government is now going to step in the economy to protect the people in various different ways. That's just a few. Another thing that we see during the Progressive Era is the definite expansion of democracy. We have amendments to the Constitution, such as the 17th and the 19th. 17th is basically going to give more rights to the American people to actually vote their own senators into office, practice we have today thanks to the 17th Amendment, and the 19th Amendment, which is all about women's suffrage and giving women the right to vote. We also have the initiative, the referendum, and the recall, which is going to allow Americans to have more rights as far as they can actually take a politician out of power if that politician has become corrupt and is not working for the people, and that the people are also going to be able to put down and vote on laws if their own legislative branch is not doing that. So what you really have during the Progressive Era is really this expansion of individual liberties. Now, just like we talked about in period 4, a lot of these progressives, a lot of these people pushing for these reforms are going to be women. They're going to be middle class. And during the Progressive Era, they're oftentimes going to be living in urban areas as well. Now, whenever we talk about wars, World War I, World War II during this period, we're not really going to talk a whole lot about that. I do plan to put up PowerPoints in the past so that you guys can see more of that breakdown. But just understand that whenever America becomes involved in the World War I, a lot of the ideology at this time that President Wilson really puts out is that America is getting involved to protect people's rights and try to expand democracy. So the role of the United States at this time is starting to shift into this ideology that the country should, whenever it becomes involved in other affairs, should work to protect and expand democracy and liberties abroad. Now, after World War I, what we're going to see is that Wilson is very active and trying to exert American influence in a way in which we can protect freedoms, rights, democracy, such as becoming very active, the Treaty of Versailles. And one of the things he's really known for is pushing for the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations is the first truly international organization that we had in which different countries unite and all work together to try to preserve global peace and basically try to stop another world war from happening again. Now, we do know that that ends up not being successful because we have World War II. And in fact, the League of Nations is going to dissolve. We do get the UN after World War II. But Wilson at the time is really pushing for the development of this organization. One of the reasons it's not going to be successful, though, is because the United States actually doesn't join the League of Nations, which is kind of ironic if you think about the fact that one of the reasons it formed in the first place was because the US president pushed for it so heavily. And Wilson's basically going to spend the rest of his life trying to travel across the United States to persuade people that we need to join the League of Nations. But after World War I, you're going to have an American population that starts wanting to get out of the affairs of other nations and starts wanting to be more like an isolationist nation. And so whenever we look at the interwar period, that is the idea as far as the majority of American public is going to support isolationism as our foreign policy. Now, during this time period, we also have the Great Migration, which is a mass movement. This is during World War I and during the 20s, a mass migration of African Americans out of the South into the North, in particular northern urban areas, to try to seek better jobs, better living conditions, more rights, basically try to better themselves and their future descendants. All right, so the 1920s, a lot of stuff happening in the 1920s. If I could summarize the 1920s, it would really be this. There is a lot of conflict, a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different sections of the American society that is really butting heads. So, to break that down, first thing we should talk about is the Red Scare, which this is the first Red Scare in American history. After World War II, we are going to see the second Red Scare. This Red Scare is really going to occur because you have a revolution in Russia in which we see a communist regime, the creation of a communist regime in Russia. And as such, a lot of Americans are going to become very paranoid and fear that America will fall to communism, that there will be a communist takeover within the United States. Basically, red, that word Red Scare, red itself just represents communism. So it's literally fear that the American public had of a communist takeover or of communism itself. Now, this Red Scare is going to target and going to definitely oppress certain areas of our society, such as people who didn't always conform, and a lot of the edges of society, or the quote-unquote radicals at this time. And then, in addition, immigrants. And one of the things that we see during the Red Scare, the first Red Scare, is going to be Italian immigrants who are actually accused of murder, and they're put to trial. And there was a lot of evidence to prove that they are innocent. However, because of the prejudice, because of the Red Scare and the fear during this time period, these Italian immigrants are eventually going to be put to death. And you can really stalk that and really look at that as the main cause of that being the Red Scare. Because of the Red Scare during this time period, we are also going to see, and in a reaction to the rise of immigration rates earlier, we are really going to see a decrease in immigration, a massive decrease in immigration. In particular, immigration that is the quote-unquote new immigrants, such as other parts of Europe, like South and Eastern Europe, as well as Asia. And we're going to see quotas actually state very low numbers for these new immigrants to try to stop and slow down immigration from the quote-unquote undesirable areas of the world, according to some nativist ideology at this time. Now, even whenever we look at the Quota Acts of 1920s, I do want you guys to know that these Quota Acts, the restriction of immigration is going to last for a couple of decades. And even whenever we see the Chinese Exclusion Act and actually nullified. And we see immigration from China start to rise because of the Quota Acts. We're actually only going to see the very first flow of Chinese again immigrating into the United States, very low numbers of a mere 100 or around a mere 100 because of these Quota Acts. One thing I can do is actually show you guys this chart over here so you can really see what I was talking about with the flow of immigration. So as you see in this chart, total immigrants by decades, you can see that during period 6, during the late 1800s, we're really going to have, and early 1900s, we're really going to have a rise in immigration. However, as you can see, 1920s, it just plummets. And that's because of what's happening, the Red Scare and these Quota Acts and the rise in nativist ideology. Okay. Something else about the 1920s and this time period to really understand is there's a lot of new technology and a lot of consumer culture, which is actually creating a sense of national culture. Not only do we have cars, for an example, and refrigerators that is making life more convenient, making life easier, and also making a shared lifestyle for people across the country. But we also have the radio. And the radio for this time period acts as a TV. People get together around the radio for their evening entertainment. And this radio, this shared sense of entertainment that is viewed across the country, is going to create a national culture. Because people all the way from the east to the west coast are watching, or at least listening, right, to the same things and finding the same source of entertainment. So a lot of conflicts, like we mentioned earlier. You have conflicts between modernization and traditionalism. That's a huge thing, especially whenever we look at gender roles at this time. You have a lot of women who are pushing for more rights. You guys remember during this time period, women's role was really confined to the private sphere. That cult of domesticity, the idea that the woman's role should be to take care of the children, to raise the children, take care of the husband, and that their role should be a very private one with the middle and upper class. But at this time, you have a lot of women, middle and upper class, as well as lower socioeconomic status women, who are really trying to push forth with more rights and really liberate themselves from the confinement of that private sphere. We also have the clash of Christianity versus science. A good example of this is the Scopes trial, in which we have creationism. Creationism is the Christian belief of the creation of the world. And then you have evolution, which is the scientific belief for the creation of the world. And you actually have a trial because we have a science teacher who teaches evolution in a state in which the law was to teach creationism. And as such, it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually finds the evolutionist teacher to be guilty. However, the trial is overturned. You're also going to have a clash between the new immigrants and those native-born people who are holding on to that nativist ideology. You're also going to have a clash here between the KKK and groups that want to oppress African Americans and African Americans. A good example of this is going to be the Red Summer of 1919. You guys know that Native Americans through the Great Migration were really migrating at this time to try to find a better life for themselves. And what we're going to see is in some of those cities, we're going to see a series of race riots in 1919 especially. You're also going to see a rise in lynchings during this time period. You're also going to see a rise in the KKK activity and really a clash between these oppressors and the oppressed who are trying to fight back to make a better life for themselves. Another defining moment or theme of this time period is the change that's happening in American culture into this living on credit. This idea that to be American and to live the American dream is to accumulate all this stuff so that you can have a good life, a happy, convenient life. And this is really going to push forth, and a lot of this is marketing at this time, really push forth this idea that you need to just consume all this stuff. There's no way like the American way. The only problem is people don't really have money to pay for that stuff, but that's okay because in America we have installment plans in which you don't have to have the money right now. You can actually go ahead and have your car, have your new device for your household, and just pay it off in separate installment plans monthly. So really we see the growth of credit, consumer culture, and living off or consuming these goods and paying them back slowly and living off of money that you do not have. All right, something else to add on to our 1920s. Just as you have those oppressors trying to oppress African Americans and African Americans trying to fight back, you do have a growth in African American cultures, in particular African American communities. The Harlem Renaissance is particularly in New York, in which you have this community of people uniting, getting together and trying to celebrate their heritage, their culture, and their identity in a lot of different cultural ways through art, through music, writing for the time period. This is known as the Harlem Renaissance. Now, we're going to have the Great Depression, and in response to that Great Depression, we are going to have Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Just so you guys know, a recession is a little dip in the economy, such as what we're going through right now, and that's normal, right? Because we are a capitalist nation in which the government doesn't intervene very much in the economy, and as such, the people have complete control, which means that you have times of economic growth, slight times of a decline in that growth, and then a rise and a fall. That's really natural. It's really healthy, really normal. However, a depression is where instead of just a small dip, such as a recession, you have a massive dip. So what we're going right now through, is arguably a recession. However, it really depends on how the economy is going to bounce back. If we have a long period of time in which the economy does not bounce back, then this will be known as a depression. So it really has to deal with the severity of that economic decline. So Great Depression means rise in unemployment, the crashing of the stock market, people are not able to make money, production is going to slow down. And what we're really going to see because of the Great Depression is a massive growth in federal power at this time. We're going to have the New Deal, which is Franklin Roosevelt's policy of trying to help the American economy to recover. Really focuses on relief for the American people, methods to get it back on track to recovery, and reform of our economy. So what we're going to see here is some actual jobs that are going to put Americans back to work, for an example. We are going to see relief in the form of sometimes actual foodstuffs given to people to help them to survive, as well as the creation of programs to help the American people, such as Social Security, help elderly who cannot work for themselves. And this is really going to change things. And it's changed things, and this change that's going to occur during this time period is still active today. And this relationship between the government and the economy. Because remember, capitalism is built on this idea that there's a separation between the two. But with Roosevelt's New Deal, it's all about the government being active in the economy to try to help the economy to grow. And as such, that's really anti-laissez-faire. That's really against the idea of free market capitalism, which is why in class, I mentioned this before, but the current United States is not quite completely a free market capitalist structure. We're more like a free market with socialistic tendencies. You can argue against that if you would like to, but that's my viewpoint of all this. We are going to see people try to fight back against this, thinks that the federal government is becoming too strong during this time period. Some conservatives, as well as the Supreme Court, that actually limit some of these New Deal programs. However, you also have people on the opposite spectrum, people who are saying that we need more change and more federal programs and more intervention in the economy, such as Huey Long, who really advocates for that. There's a lot of impacts of the New Deal, so much impacts, not just within the economy at this time period, but in the economy today. A couple of different ones that we can just really quick talk about is the FDIC, in which the federal government protects your money whenever you put it in the bank. So it protects your deposits. So even if that bank goes out of business, you're still going to get your money. The federal government has ensured that. And that really helps people to trust the banking system again. And then we have Social Security, which, like I mentioned earlier, gives sums of money to elderly who cannot work for themselves. The idea is you pay on Social Security all throughout your life, just a little bit, so that whenever you retire and become of age, you can get a little bit of that back. So you pay in to help right now the elderly, and eventually you will be helped yourself. It's important to note that while the New Deal did help Americans to get back working, it's very interesting because some of the things in which the American people were doing, such as building a certain post offices, for example, what we are really going to see is some of those post offices are actually still being used. There's certain community centers and certain schools that are going to be built to try to get the American people working again and help develop the United States. And that development, some of that is still used, especially in the countryside, such as here in Arkansas today. Now, we are going to see a massive change in voting and a massive change in a political alignment here within the United States. So it's really interesting because we look at the development of the Republican Party, right, and we look at the development of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, at the beginning of its development, was about actually stopping the spread of slavery. And for the radical Republicans, not only was it stopping that expansion of slavery, but it was giving African Americans equal rights and completely eradicating slavery within the United States. And so at the birth of the Republican Party was actually more about government control, more government intervention to give people more rights and to stop slavery within the states. But during this New Deal, we are going to see a complete reversal of some of those policies, and in which now the Republican Party is going to stand for a more conservative view and really stopping or limiting the expansion of the federal government. And we're going to see the Democratic Party really begin to represent not necessarily just an expansion of the federal government, but a federal government that actually becomes involved in the economy on the behalf of the common folk. And a lot of people at the time that support the Democratic Party, there's a big change in those who are the supporters. We're going to see more African Americans, more lower income. We're going to see some immigrant ethnic groups and unions support the Democratic Party. And this change that's happening during the 1920s politically, yeah, that change is still around today. So there's a lot of changes politically and a big political realignation that's really happening right here. Okay, we're almost done. World War II. It's important to note that the interwar periods, U.S. foreign policy was supposedly isolationism. You can really argue against that, though, with the Lend-Lease Act and basically profiting somewhat from this war. However, what we're really going to see is the United States becomes really involved in this war because of Pearl Harbor. And whenever our country becomes involved in this war, we are going to see mass mobilization and the use of the American economy and the American industry to really develop the items that you need to wage war. And this mass mobilization, this is really what's going to end the Great Depression. And while we have this Great Depression ending, we have a federal government that is spending a lot of money to develop this wartime industry infrastructure. And that's actually one of the things that's going to help develop the Western United States, such as parts of California, for example. One of the things that we're also going to see is more economic opportunities for women and African Americans, as a lot of men are fighting abroad. You have gaps in the labor force, and these gaps in the labor force are going to be filled by people that wouldn't traditionally fill them. And as a result, we do see an expansion at this time for opportunities and a social expansion for women and African Americans. It's really interesting This is not just World War II, but World War I and the Civil War. This is kind of a commonality that we see. In times of warfare, we do generally see more rights and opportunities for women. So you have America at this time, and just like World War I, World War II is going to become encased in the American public as this ideology that the United States is fighting for freedoms, fighting for liberty, fighting against totalitarian governments that want to take away the rights of the people, that are treating their people horrible, that we're fighting for others abroad and for the growth of democracy to make the world a better place. This is ideology and propaganda from this time period. And so the United States is saying one thing, right? But if you actually look within the United States, there is something that you see entirely different. You have the oppression of minority groups. You have racial segregation, the oppression of human rights. And so America is claiming one thing while at the same time doing another thing. And what we're going to really see is because of this, because of World War II, because of these claims being made that America should stand for, we're really going to see a rise in people to start supporting the civil rights movement and start supporting the ending of segregation. And it's not a coincidence that after World War II, we are going to have the Supreme Court that's going to start standing up to end segregation. And we are going to see an increase in the civil rights movement. And a lot of it's due to this World War II and a lot of these debates that's happening at this time. We're going to see encouraged immigration from Mexico, such as the Bracero program. Here in the home front, World War I and World War II, we have laws, legislation that are being put forth in World War I, such as the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, which is basically going to limit freedom of speech and limit human rights within the United States. During both of those wars, those laws are going to be challenged in the courts. And in both of those wars, the courts are going to uphold the denial of human rights during times of war. In World War II, we have the creation of Japanese internment camps, in which we have a president who has an executive order that forces Japanese Americans to be rounded up and to be sent to holding centers. This is due to racism, bigotry. This is due to downright paranoia and fear of the American people that Japanese in America might be spies and sending information to Japan. And because of all these things, we are going to have a government that not only has this executive order, but upholds this executive order in the Supreme Court. Now, if you guys look at these pictures, this one right here is an image of a Japanese internment camp that was here in Arkansas. You guys know we had two in the Delta. This is one of them. And then I also have an image of this Japanese lady right here. And I found her story pretty cool. And she is a woman who was in an Arkansas internment camp. And as such, she was a very famous dancer from LA, very famous for having her Japanese cultural dance. And whenever she is forced into this internment camp, she actually uses this and uses what she knows and the dances that she knows as an opportunity to bring others joy. And she actually travels to a couple of different internment camps in the areas to do her dances, to try to encourage celebration and heritage, and people retaining their culture and uplifting spirits at this time. And not only does she do these dances, but she actually uses this as an opportunity to teach other people these dances as well. So I thought that her story was pretty cool, so I wanted to show you guys that. One thing, and then we're going to go on with the Japanese internment camp, that I want you guys to understand is these are not just first-generation immigrants. These are not Japanese people, most of them anyways, that just traveled into the United States. These are people who were born within the United States, who are American citizens, not green card holders, right? Not here on a visa, citizenship. And And sometimes these people are second and maybe even third generation immigrants as well, that this is happening to. So these are American peoples whose human rights, the right to live where you want to do what you want, to try to create a better life for yourself and your family, these core foundations that America stands for or is supposed to stand for, these rights are being taken away from these people at this time. And you have a Supreme Court that, whenever it's challenged, says, yes, these rights can be taken away because it's in times of warfare. All right, so end of World War II. If you guys didn't know, the Allies won. They did defeat the Axis powers. A couple different reasons. We can chalk it up to the Allies' cooperation between allied nations. You can chalk it up to successful campaigns. Your AP curriculum actually mentions some, like the island hopping and the D-Day invasions. Another big reason is the industrial production of the United States. The United States is going to enter the war later than the other allied powers, and as a result, the United States has the backing of the United States economy in this war, being able to, that mass mobilization, able to produce the stuff you need to wage war very effectively, and mass production of these items is going to help the Allies to win this war, as well as one of the things oftentimes talked about is the American spirit, the fact that the American soldiers were not fighting in this long, drawn-out war like some of the other allied nations was. The United States came late enough in the game that they're kind of like fresh blood to the scene. Another big reason is going to be the American technology and science that is developed. You guys, we talked about the Manhattan Project and the building and the dropping and the usage of nuclear warfare, the first time in ever the world history that we see this, which is going to be that final push to ending the war in the Pacific theater. So what we're going to see is, by the end of this war, the United States is really going to emerge as a superpower. A superpower because of the United States' economic strength, because of the vast resources, and a superpower too because a lot of the fighting that had happened in World War II didn't happen within the United States. You have a lot of areas in Europe and a lot of areas in Asia, some areas in Africa in which fighting took place. And as such, these nations have to rebuild and develop their country's infrastructure again. But the United States doesn't have to. So all these things kind of accumulate together into, at the end of World War II, the United States emerges as the most powerful nation within the world, which is, you can debate where the United States still stands as far as economic power goes. All right, guys, that's it for our content. Now, make sure that you're reviewing on your own. Any knowledge gaps you have, make sure that you are bridging those. Make sure that you are, staying self-motivated. Also, your DBQs. You guys are getting better. You really are. Some of you guys already came into class with good DBQs, and you're maintaining that. But a lot of you guys who didn't really have much experience writing DBQs, they're getting so much better. I'm really proud of you guys for that. So as such, you guys know, if you have any questions, you can feel free to text me on Remind, email me. Be safe, guys. All right, bye for now.